Welcome to the next session of our study, The Law of God's Kingdom, Understanding the Sermon on the Mount. This session is entitled, But I Say to You, Jesus and the authority concerning the law. In the last session, we looked at the true nature of the law and its fulfillment. The term law, in Hebrew Torah, means instruction. And the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, are largely narrative. It's the story of God's covenant with Israel. It begins with the creation story and then moves on to the patriarchs, the exodus from Egypt, the encounter of the people of Israel with God at Mount Sinai, and then the initial conquest east of the Jordan. Of course, the full conquest of Canaan we don't see until the book of Joshua. So it ends with the arrival at the river Jordan and the reiteration of the law, Deuteronomy. So Jesus fulfills the law. That's what he says. He fulfills the law through perfect observance. He keeps the law. He walks in God's way, just as God prescribed from the beginning. But he also fulfills the law by becoming the perfect sacrifice. And he fulfills the law in fulfilling all the prophecies contained in the law, right from Genesis through to Deuteronomy. And of course, not just the law, but the law and the prophets and the Psalms. So at the center of Torah, of the narrative of God's people, the story of God's people and God's covenant with his people, at the center of Torah is the encounter and the giving of the covenant, the establishment of the covenant at Mount Sinai with the giving of the law. In Exodus 19, we read, as they arrive at Mount Sinai, and Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and laid before them all these words which the Lord commanded him. Then all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So God calls a people. He calls them by grace, by election, not by merit, not because of what they have done. In fact, he calls a people of slaves. He makes promises to Abraham that his descendants will become his people. But then he allows them to be slaves in Egypt so that he can deliver them. He wants a people that will depend on him, walking with God, depending on God. That is true fulfillment of God's law. And that's what Jesus did. He will be their God, and they will be his people. They will depend on his power, on his grace. The call of God is always a call to obedience. It's not a call to lawlessness. It's a call to obedience. It's a commitment to obey. The people say, All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Of course, as we read on in the story, we soon discover that they don't. Note at this point, there are no commandments at all. Chapter 19. It's only in chapter 20 that the 10 commandments are given. The purpose of God's call is that he will reveal himself through his people, through Israel, to all people, to the world. God calls a people to reveal himself to them and through them as a light to the nations, to all people. And of course, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talks about, You are the light of the world. It's all the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. God says to Abraham when he calls him out of idolatry, He says to him, I will bless you and make you a blessing to all nations. But then in chapter 20, God initially gives 10 commandments. He gives a basic outline for relationship with him and with one another. The people with him and the people with one another. But the 10 commandments begin with a reminder of God's deliverance, of his grace. At the center is always God's grace. Exodus 20, reading from verse 2 to 17. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. God writes these 10 commandments on 2 tables. Why 2 tables? In fact, if we read clearly, it says the laws are written on both sides of the tables, front and back. Often when we see pictures, we see half the laws on the one side and half the commandments on one table and the other half on the other table. But actually, both sides were written on. And both sides most probably contained exactly the same. There were 2 copies. A covenant has 2 copies. It's like when you do a contract. When you sign a contract, there is a copy for you to keep and a copy for the other party. But of course, God gives 2 tables to show this is a contract, a relationship, a covenant. There are obligations. It is a relationship, but it's a relationship initiated by God. Just as God initiated the call of Abraham, God initiates, God calls a people, he delivers them, and he gives the law. But the response, the appropriate response is worship, worshiping the God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. Worship is a consequence of recognizing who God is, the creator, the ruler of the universe, and our deliverer. Worship is a response to recognizing God, to the covenant initiated by God. The first commandments, and sometimes there are different views on whether if it's 4 commandments or 5, where the split actually comes, which are the first 4 or 5. But the first commandments have to do with worshiping God. You shall have no other gods. You shall not make an image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. In fact, the Hebrew word used here is, you shall not bear the name of the Lord your God in vain. That is significant. They are to bear his name, to be a witness. And then remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. In a sense, the Sabbath creates a link between relationship with God and relationship with one another. Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Sabbath is a day of rest. God rested, not because God was tired, but because everything was complete. A people of slaves who knew no rest are now given rest. But rest is also a time, not just to enjoy, that's part of it, but it's a time to focus on the Creator, the one who gives rest. The New Testament tells us that Jesus is our rest. So the first commandments have to do with worshiping God, and the Sabbath creates that link. It's about rest, completion. The seventh day is about completion of creation. But it's also about putting God at the center, having no distraction, focusing entirely on God. The remaining covenants then have to do with relationships with one another. It begins with honoring parents. Of course, Jesus, as I said in a previous session, Jesus expounds this. Honoring parents means taking care of them, looking after them. And the Pharisees and scribes, they'd found ways around this law by giving gifts to the temple, to God, and then saying, well, I've done my due. I don't owe my parents anything anymore. They actually were breaking this commandment. Honor your parents. The focus here changes to relationship between people, relationships within the community of God, the community that God is creating. The 10 Commandments are a basic outline. Many more specific laws are introduced later in the narrative, but they're always added. They're added as a response to sin. As the people commit certain sins, more laws are given. And in Deuteronomy, they're reiterated. Deuteronomy translates as the second law, but really it's the reiteration of the law, and there are additions to the law given in preparation for living in the land, in the promised land, preempting already that the people will disobey. God tells them already, you will disobey. And as you do, I will hide my face from you. That's in Deuteronomy 31 and 32. And of course, that's where we find the exile. Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, where he discusses law and grace, says that the law was added because of transgression. He understood this. It was because of the people's sin that God gave more and more specific laws. And it gets very, very complicated. However, God's original purpose was that all should be in relationship with Him. All should be in relationship with Him, know Him and walk with Him in obedience. Because obedience follows relationship, it comes out of relationship. Relationship is the key. I am the Lord your God, you must worship me. Really, there's no need for rules and regulations for those who know God and obey God because they love God. That's why all the commandments are summed up in love. God the Father speaks from heaven, says, this is my beloved Son. Of Jesus, he says, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. He says this at the baptism when the Holy Spirit descends like a dove upon Jesus and the voice comes from heaven, but also at the Mount of Transfiguration. And there the Father adds, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. Listen to him. Moses and Elijah appear there, but they disappear. And then this voice from heaven comes because everything is fulfilled in Jesus. He fulfills the law and the prophets, Moses and Elijah. Hear him. Jesus comes to fulfill. He comes to restore God's original plan, his original purpose. Therefore, Jesus is the perfect Son. He comes from heaven as the divine man to be the perfect Son. What the people failed to do, Jesus did. This is God's way of creating for himself a perfect people through Jesus, his Son, his only begotten. He creates for himself a people, and that's why he sends the Spirit. But more about that to follow. Therefore, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus goes beyond the surface. He goes beyond outward observance. The Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the scribes, they were concerned very much with outward observance, but Jesus gets to the heart. Matthew 5:17. We looked at this before. Jesus says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." Unless your righteousness exceeds theirs, goes beyond theirs, goes to the heart. And he gives examples from the law as given by Moses. And then he provides an antithesis using the words, "But I say to you." Now that's a very bold statement. Moses said, the law says, the infallible law says, "But I say to you." What is Jesus actually saying by that? Jesus is not adding to the constant rabbinical debate about interpretation, different schools of the oral law. There were different schools. Shammai, Hillel, there were different schools of thought. There's a saying that if you have two rabbis, you have three opinions, because of course in the culture of the Talmud, of the rabbis, there are always different ways of looking at things, and there's always debate and interpretation, and one respects the others. But Jesus does not join the debate. He says, "But I say to you." He speaks with absolute authority. He has the final say. He settles the matter. He ends the argument. There is no more debate. The fact is, only the Messiah can do this. Only he can say, if he is the Messiah, he can say, "But I say to you." Note that the passage of the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 to 7, concludes, looked at this before, the last two verses of chapter 7:28, as the people go away. "So it was when Jesus had ended these sayings that the people were astonished at his teaching. For he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes." What this verse really is telling us, the people were asking themselves, they were astonished, they were asking themselves, could this man truly be the Messiah? In that case, if he is, then this is the true law. This is the true law of the kingdom, fulfillment of all God's purpose, which evidently with the arrival of the Messiah has arrived. The kingdom has arrived. In the next session, we'll go further with this. The title will be "Getting to the Heart." We'll look at 5 examples from the law of Moses and their original context, examples that Jesus mentions, and he says, "But I say to you." Brings out God's intention, righteousness of the heart. The examples of the laws are murder, adultery, swearing, retaliation, and ultimately love. Love that fulfills everything. Loving God and loving others. So join us for the next session, Getting to the Heart.